Okay, good afternoon, Year 13. We're going to talk today about the commander, and our central learning question will be looking at whether the commander is a villain or a victim. I think that is quite a difficult question, quite an interesting one, and the final essay question that we'll think about is whether we see men as oppressors in Gilead or whether we see them as victims, perhaps even as much as women. Now, symbolism here, you should remember, is absolutely key. On the one hand, we have the idea of the moth's balls that you will remember from the ceremony. And we talked about the AO2 connotations of the mothballs, the idea that the commander is rancid, old, he's associated with this kind of parasite, the semi-parasite, the moth. Also, you might remember there's a further association of the commander, which is the idea that his aftershave is punitive. And I'm going to suggest to you that's reminiscent of these guys, the flagellants. These guys were very strict and devout Catholics who beat themselves. Whether we see the commander then as someone hurting himself with his aftershave or hurting Offred. In both cases, as I said before, for AO2, swagging that symbolism, we see the commander as the opposite of erotica and sexuality, someone who wants to hurt the flesh rather than stroke it. I'm going to suggest to you that the great problem with the characterization in the Hulu TV series, as we can see, one, the commander's too young. He's far too good looking. And this actor in real life, I read, is an athlete and a mountain climber. And if you actually look at him, I think there's a good picture of him, his posture is excellent, isn't he? He holds himself like an athlete. You're going to see the true description of the commander as someone who's stooped and in fact in many ways quite weak. This is a far better picture, I think you'll agree. This is the movie made in 1990 by David Cronenberg. I suggest you watch it. David Cronenberg is one of the most famous sci-fi directors, very famous for his pyrotechnics. So some of you here, media studies students, may know he's made films like Dead Ringer, famous sci-fi filmmaker, okay? Now, this is a very famous actor. His name is Robert Duvall. Some of you may know him. He often plays like Italian gangster, like Godfather-style characters. So in some ways, you might think that he's a bit too glamorous to be the commander, but at least I think he has the agedness, the baldness, getting the paunch, the belly, the stoopedness, and there's definitely, as you can see from the picture, an age divide between the two of them. And I think that this is really important to bring out the horror of the ceremony. If the ceremony in any way smacks of being kind of sex, then I think it's spoiled. And I think that might be one of the problems with the TV series. I much prefer the idea of the commander more as a kind of parent, because I think it makes the ceremony more repulsive and it brings out the kind of sense of horror, claustrophobia, and this kind of age gap between the two of them. Now, you'll recall this is perhaps the most famous quote. After, he looks like a Midwestern bank president with a straight, neatly brushed silver hair, his sober posture, shoulders a little stooped. I'm going to deal with this quote in quite a lot of detail now. You'll recall just before this bit of the quote, he's referred to as having a black uniform. Now, as I show you here, the idea of the black uniform might actually conjure up a kind of militarism here, like an SS idea of this black uniform as being quite sinister and threatening. And what I'm going to show you now, and this is an important AO2 point, is that Margaret Atwood often gives us large lists of metaphors and symbols. Sometimes they conflict with one another. So we get this idea of the militaristic black uniform, but that is immediately undercut by the fact that he looks like a museum guard. So any kind of sexy, glamorous militarism that you might be thinking of here, SS standard, is immediately undercut. And we call this bathos in literature. You've all heard of that before, haven't you? It's the technical term for anticlimax. So we're given an image which might be considered glamorous, and immediately it's deflated. And the commander really seems boring, doesn't he? Boring and dull. And I'm going to be suggesting to you that one of Margaret Atwood's big themes is the banality of evil. Banality meaning the boringness of evil. Some of you may have read about the SS people who ran the concentration camps that killed millions of Jews. And what a lot of historians have found was they were really boring people. And that's where the phrase, the banality of evil, comes from. Rather than being monsters and demons and like terrible satanic figures, they were people who played Scrabble in the evening. And that's where I think it would be interesting to use the idea of the banality of evil as AO3 context when we're talking about the commander. Now, guys, as you see here, two pictures that I think you'll find interesting. Do you recall that the commander was referred to as a Midwestern banker? And I said to you, the Midwest of the United States is the most dull and featureless part of America. This was the first image that came up on Google for Midwestern Bank, and guess what bank it is? It's called the Midwestern Bank. And I think it sort of sums up the idea of a kind of dull and featureless aspect of the United States. And this chap over here was the first Google image that came up when I Googled Midwestern banker. Now, if I go back very quickly to our handsome commander, I think you see that the characterization doesn't necessarily work. So I'm going to say that I prefer our rather dull, semi-balding Midwestern banker. What about you guys? Do you agree with me? Because he looks entirely bereft of sexuality, doesn't he? He looks dull. And I think that's one of the things about the commander, is that the commander is a dull suit man, isn't he? Kind of corporate man in many ways. And I think this chap is quite interesting because he hardly looks like a strong guy, does he? He looks like there would be weakness in him, doesn't he? And this is the element I think we're going to see with the commander. If he's a villain, he's a rather pitiful villain, isn't he? He's not Hitler. He's more of a kind of nasty guy next door who throws stones at your cat kind of guy, isn't he? Also just wanted to remind you as well that we have this whole idea of the domestic, of the domesticity of the commander. Do you remember he loves the Bible readings, doesn't he? And he's going to love Scrabble. So rather than getting offered to visit him in his office for all sorts of grotesque and unmentionable sexual things, he actually, once again, do you remember the idea of bathos? Just wants to play Scrabble with her, like she's his auntie almost, yeah? Moving on quickly. Two things. If we're going to see the commander in a sympathetic light and feel a bit sorry for him and see him as a victim, then we might look at the fact that he's playing Scrabble. It sort of suggests he's really lonely, doesn't it? And that he doesn't have intimacy, that he's estranged from his wife, that he has no friends, that he's just a domestic, ordinary guy. You'll notice quite often he's referred to as tired. And when, in the end, the angels and the eyes, come to take Offred, he's described as defeated. So he doesn't sound like he's in charge. There are acts of kindness. He gives her makeup. He gives her magazines. He treats her with more respect than Serena does. As I say, he's domesticated. And during this ceremony, we see that he's not happy with the ceremony, that he wants more. He seeks a kiss. He seeks intimacy. Those things might make you a little bit more sympathetic to the commander. Would you agree? But let's not forget, there's plenty to make the commander a villain. Most importantly, I think the idea that he is doing something to the lower part of my body makes him seem brutal and mechanical. He's associated, as we saw, with the mothballs. We began the presentation with that, with the punitive aftershave, And most of all, I'm going to be focusing on this idea of condescension. He speaks down to her. He patronizes her. We can see that he's filled with incredibly sexist patriarchal ideology. And we mustn't forget that the commander has power. So in some ways, you might be more hostile to the commander than Serena, because even though arguably he's nicer because he has an interesting life, doesn't he? He has power. He goes out into the public sphere. He makes decisions in life. Serena, on the other hand, is claustrophobic and her life is completely restricted. And so I'm going to end here by saying that the focus will be on this important essay title that's already come up twice from the AQA board. In Gilead, men are victims too. So our learning question today as we go through the different passages will be, to what extent do we agree with that? Are we going to see the commander as a victim, partly a victim, or are we going to err more towards the idea that the commander is a villain and that our reception of him is hostile?